from Cerberus USA here, and today we are talking log press, but more specifically we're dedicating this video, the entire video, just to the clean. The clean is by far the most energy zapping component of the log press. If we can get it to the shoulders, then the whole pressing side of it is somewhat easy. The clean is by far the limiting factor in this. You'll see a lot of guys who have big presses, 300, 350, 400 pound presses from a rack, but when it comes to getting the log from the floor to their shoulders, then that's where they fall down. So that's why we're dedicating this whole video specifically to the clean. So we're going to talk about a couple of main components in this. First one's going to be equipment. Second is going to be the initial pull or into the lap, and then we're going to talk about the roll and then the actual rack position itself. So let's get started and initially talk about equipment. Okay, so with equipment, let's talk briefly about things which are they're not needed, but they either are wanted from a personal preference standpoint, or secondly from a standpoint of making the lift easier. So for me, Olympic shoes. These have been my go-to for over a decade. For any overhead pressing movement, I'm always in Olympic shoes. For me personally, I like having that little heel lift, but then it forces me, because if I have a log in front of me, it can pull you forward into your toes slightly. It forces me to get onto my heels so that when I press, I am getting that nice stacked movement pattern. So that's the footwear. So let's talk about belts now. So for me personally, a soft belt. This is the brand new Cerberus neoprene belt. I've had a reband of this same style of belt, type of belt, for again over a decade. For me personally, with this belt, it allows me just to create a bit more of a shelf. And I think this is super important for guys who are smaller stature as well. For me, if I push my gut out, I can create a shelf just with my abdominal pressure and then my gut. But I like putting the belt on because it accentuates that. Accentuates my figure. So with the reband, or not the reband, but the reband style soft belt, the Cerberus one that we've got now, what this does when I get it tight, before I even press out, I have a bit of a shelf just because it's holding everything up, so to speak. Now this is good for lighter stuff, but honestly, even with lighter stuff, I'm using a lever belt. So I have my lever here. It's a 13mm lever belt. It can be a 10mm if you want it to be, whatever you want. So for me right now, I've got both prongs in there. It's going to be pretty tight. So for me, if I tighten this up, it's super tight. So it's almost too tight. If you want it a little bit looser, a quick tip is to take the first two prongs and just put those into the first two holes instead of all 4 and 4. And then you've got it tight but a little bit looser. I don't know how much that is, maybe an inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch, whatever it may be. So this is my personal setup. And then when it gets heavier, knee sleeves, elbow sleeves, I wear warm shorts when I'm actually fully training, all that sort of stuff, wrist wraps at a certain point, all that sort of thing. So that's all the equipment stuff talked about. Let's get into the actual movement. Let's talk about the initial pull. Okay, so for the initial pull, we want to basically get it off the ground into our lap to a position that when we do the roll and flick our hips and all that good stuff, we get it into a nice rack position. And a lot of that comes from the position of the log in your lap. So if I tighten the belt up, and I want this to basically create another shelf, like I said. So here is angled down very slightly. You might not look it, but it's a tiny little angle so that I get even more shelf. Now what I'm doing is I get my feet, I'm almost at the handles. A lot of this again is personal preference. Pull this back so you can definitely see. So this is personal preference for me, where I like to be. And where I find this from is I basically try and imagine that I'm walking up from a rack with a barbell or an axle or log, whatever, and this is where my feet are going to be. I look down, okay, that's where I'm lining up. that's where I want to have, because I want to basically keep my feet in the same position as if I possibly can, from the initial pull the whole way to the press. So I got my feet set. The big one now is that when it's in the lap, when you flick to roll it, you want to flick and roll through and drive those elbows under. If you have the log sitting too flat, when you flick it, you're going to get here and not be able to roll it properly, completely the whole way. You'll see a lot of these guys get stuck and then jolt it up into position. So for me, I want the log pointing, basically pointing forward. So I'll have it here. That's my starting position. Now, so when I pull, I basically lift, I almost like deadlift it up and then sit down, and then I basically rebound out. Now it's not going to look like that in this because we're doing step by step, but then when I put it all together, you'll see what I mean. So for me, I'm coming down, I'm getting my grip, I actually go onto my toes, and then I roll back into my heels, pick, and sit, and then it's pointing forward, very slightly. But from that position, I've got it where I want it and high up on my sternum as well. So that way when I actually pin and roll and flick, it's coming straight up. Now for this, I personally feel right now doing that pick super uncomfortable, simply because I never stop in the lap. So it's a little bit of a different process trying to do it on video and break it down. Because normally what I would do is going to be like this. So I've got my setup, my feet, all that stuff. I've got the log. First of all, I'm going to make sure my belt is not sliding. This is where I want it to be. I'm going to push my belt, my stomach out, brace against the belt, come down, get the grip, onto the toes, heels, down and pop. And you can see that when I get down, because I finish finish the lap in my sternum, as soon as I start driving, it's pinned. I'm pinned in and I can roll through. So if we now break it down into the actual roll portion of it. What you want to do is when you lift and you get in your lap and you sit down, and you'll see this a lot more when you get super heavy and you almost have to stop at the lap. And that's something that, if I'm honest, I try not to do even with heavier logs, because I feel my clean from a paused lap position is slower than and harder than if I almost rebound out of the whole movement. So what we're going to do now is we want to basically go through the roll and the flicking the log, all that sort of thing. So from that rack, from the lap position, we're going to get in, we're going to lap it, and we're sitting here. Now I've got it where it's high on my sternum, and then I basically pull. You can see this. So I'm basically, when I'm down, I'm pulling and going like this. That's my starting position. And that way, when I basically start standing, I can drive my elbows under and flick them. So I'm here, pick, down, pin, stand, and flick. Now obviously, it looks way more deliberate than it did when everything was linked together. But the main thing is that we're trying to get it high so that we can pin it to us and roll and flick it through. So that's that portion of it. And obviously a lot of this is going to be trial and error. There's the main components of it that we want, and that is, pinning it to us, keeping the log slightly forward, that way we can drive under and roll up. Same with the lap, we want it as high as we can before we start that rolling process, but a lot of it is just trial and error, figuring out what works for you. You'll have guys who will almost roll the log into their lap and sit down with it. For me, I like to deadlift it more. Stuff like deadlift it, sit, and then drive out and get into that, basically straight into that roll position as soon as I hit my depth on the lap. Excuse me. So now, let's talk about the rack position itself. So with the rack position, we want something that's called an active rack position. Basically, you'll see a lot of people who will clean it, and then they'll be in their stance, they'll be in their rack, but their elbows are dipping, their upper back is loose, and they're not swaying, but that's not tight. Even if you brace, if your rack is not tight, the log can move on you. And then especially when you dip, you'll see them dip their elbows, or their elbows will dip under them, which means the log is now going to start rolling because your hand's going to come with it. We don't want that. We want an active rack position. What that means is that when we're in our rack position, our upper back is tight, our elbows are driving up into position so that when I dip, everything is super tight. That way, we get basically as much power transfer into the log as possible. Now, I'm going to at least try and talk through a rack position with the log in front of my face. Hopefully it happens. I'm going to go through the loose, the unactive rack position initially, and then we'll talk about the active rack after. So obviously, full clean, same as everything else we just been through. So clean. This is your non-active. You can see it's not tight. When I get tight and active, I get my air, everything comes up, my elbows are up, my upper back's tight. If I dip, there's no movement in it. I mean, even there, because I was so tight on the initial dip, when I come straight back up, the log is coming off my chest, even with that, just because I am so tight in the rack position. So, to go over everything again, it's all about basically hitting certain patterns. You want to pull it from the ground, get it into your lap, roll it in, and then be tight before you get into your initial press. And a lot of it said is going to be personal preference with how you want to do it. For me, I like basically stiff leg deadlifting it, sitting straight down, and then rebounding out my lat position up to the rack. I don't really tend to sit in a lat position very long. I don't feel it benefits me, and I feel it honestly diminishes my clean, to be totally honest with you. So, hopefully, that answers some questions. If you have anything specific, put them in the comments, DM me, whatever you want to do. I'm more than happy to answer questions. And until the next video, keep logging.